So Yasha, thank you so much for accepting this have a conversation together with me, and with the purpose to publish an article introducing you to the Brethren from the Earl Spencer Lodge 1420, and most likely this article will be published in January. During the preparation of our conversation, I had really the pleasure to read about your history, about what have you achieved from a Masonic point of view, and the amazing life that you went through. What I would like to ask you is, how did it all started? How did you join Masonry, and who inspired you today in Freemasonry?
Well, Antonio, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this exchange. I'm absolutely delighted. And you, of course, sent me some of these questions, which I could happily prepare for beforehand, which was very considerate of you. And the first thing that occurred to me is the beginning of something like going into Freemasonry must be for all of us a combination of circumstances. It isn't just one thing that pushes you in. And I suppose the background and culture of my upbringing, I was born in Turkey and had quite a sort of mixed international beginning, but it opened my mind to things and it exposed me to many more things than otherwise. I ended up in Israel with a law degree. And when I started doing my stage, my preparation for the legal work, the lawyer who was in charge of the practice was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Israel. And I walked into his study initially when he was about to employ me, and I saw this huge number of certificates on the wall. And I said to him, "What are all these?" And he said, "What, you don't know what these are? These are certificates of Freemasonry." I said, "I have no idea what Freemasonry is," but it took my curiosity. Next time I could go into his study, I was able to look more carefully at these certificates and started asking him questions. And he obviously saw that I was really interested. So he began to provoke me into going into Freemasonry, but wouldn't let me get in just enough to sort of get my curiosity going without letting me join. So by the time I was ready to join, you can believe that I was really, really anxious to know much more. But that was my real introduction through the fact that I was working with the Grand Master of Israel. His name was Max Seligman, by the way, great man, great friend.
Your Masonic journey is not about just Freemasonry. You have lived in Turkey, Israel, Italy, and you have been, your member in lodges all around the world. How do you look back at such a unique journey?
I think I look back and look back is right, because I'm now celebrating already my 80th birthday. So I look back quite often and have the wonderful thoughts. I have had a fantastic life. You're absolutely right. I think I appreciate your comment as a compliment, but I really was very lucky. But it's a force of circumstance. You don't choose those paths in life. And as I already just said, the fact that I was able to be in so many countries opened my mind in many ways to many more things. And I've always been curious, which is rather fortunate. I think my good luck is that I started collecting things from when I was a young boy. And this collection influenced my historical interest in items, in objects, and so forth. I remember my father used to travel. He was a businessman traveling all over the world. When he used to come back from a trip, my brother and I used to sit on either side of the table, and my father used to put coins and banknotes from the countries he had come from. And I used to get the coins, and my brother used to get all the banknotes, all the paper money. I used to take the coins and put them into little boxes with the name of the country from which they came, like China, Turkey, France. My brother used to take the banknotes and take them to the bank the next morning and get cash.
Oh, he's the smart one then.
He was, well, not only is the smart one, but he ended up of course, as a stockbroker in the city. That's what his job was. I ended up as a collector, as an antiquarian. So that sort of stuff continues. And as I mentioned, I'd already met the Grand Master of Israel. He introduced me into Freemasonry in England.
Ah.
But I already had his contact, so to speak, in Israel. So England and Israel became almost natural development for me to go into Freemasonry. And I had spent quite a lot of time in Italy, so my Italian was quite good. I had a shop selling coins and paper money and other goods in antique market in London. And I had Masonic items in there. And a good friend, an excellent friend from Italy, Ottaviano Caporali, came into my shop one day and bought some Masonic items from me. And we started a friendship, and he invited me to Italy, and that was my connection with Italy. Until I happened to be there at a very key time of the foundation of the regular Grand Lodge of Italy, which was a split from the Grand Orient. And that is my history, of course. So those three countries, Italy, Israel, and England, became almost my mother Grand Lodges.
The experience of Freemasonry, though we all, aim at the same goal, I mean, perfecting ourselves, improving ourselves and becoming better as human beings, I had different drivers. What did it strike you looking at Freemasons from different countries, the drivers that drive them to join Freemasonry?
I noted that question when you sent me the questions beforehand. And it's a little difficult to answer. I must say that what I found is the most attractive thing about Freemasonry. What is the most, not just for me, but in general, let me put it another way. The reason I think Freemasonry is the most successful institution in the world is because everyone that joins it finds his own little niche in it of something of interest to himself. It makes no difference what your interest is when you come to Freemasonry. You will find something that suits you almost perfectly. It might be the social side, it might be the ritual side, the theatrical side, the companionship, the esoteric, but each one it's like homemade for you, And this, I think, is what is the most important aspect to every Freemason, that if he can recognize his niche and adapt to it, he will find a great deal of satisfaction in Freemasonry as a whole. My interest in Freemasonry has been historic at the beginning. Towards the end, I got a little bit more into sort of the spiritual side of Freemasonry, which I'm enjoying now. But I've had colleagues who had no other interest in the dining, and totally respected. Others who had no other interest in the ritual because they love the theater. But each one of us enjoys Freemasonry to the same extent, to the same depth, in spite of the diversity of our interests.
As I mentioned to you, I live in the Netherlands, and my Masonic journey started here in the Netherlands. When I participate as a guest to Dutch rituals, I see elements of the ritual that are not reflected in the emulation, for example, or tailor as a ritual. You having been across more countries, you look at the ritual and which element you see, perform in a ritual that you say, this element should be reflected across all other countries because it represents something very important Masonically. Is there anything particular that you look into the ritual?
With that question, Antonio, you are presuming that ritual is important in Freemasonry. So that's a question, first of all, to what an extent is the ritual part of Freemasonry? I don't think ritual is I think ritual is only a tool in Freemasonry. There is much more to Freemasonry than the ritual. The ritual is what binds us and what brings us together and what reminds us of what we want and what we are doing. But what Freemasonry really is far more what is in your heart, in your spirit, in your mind, not in the practice of what you're applying. But having said all that, the development of the ritual is really, the more it is consistent, the more recognizable by everybody, the more universal Freemasonry becomes. So I wouldn't like to find differences that are too big between different countries. I like the idea, for example, that you are an ancient and accepted right Mason. I like the idea that to become an ancient and accepted Mason, you begin with the fourth degree.
Correct.
So that they're keeping the first three common, so that one of the first 3 degrees applies to everybody the same. And that becomes the basis of all the ritual. So when we ritual, we should be looking only at the first 3 degrees and not anything beyond it. But even then, we start getting into a situation where it's difficult to concentrate because the 3rd degree came in very late. So it was only 2 degrees. So maybe we should look only 2 degrees if we want what is common between all the different countries and nations. So from that point of view, I don't know if I've answered your question really. The ritual is only of some consequence, and the fact that there is huge differences between different countries just doesn't matter. As long as the initiation and of the 2nd degree, the fellow crafts, is taken into account, clearly everybody has got to go through those 2 items before they can be called Freemasons. But beyond that concept, that basic concept, the ritual is effectively inconsequential. I hope nobody is going to shoot me for saying so.
No, I don't, and I really like the angle that you're taking. The ritual in itself is not the purpose. It's just a mean that we use to improve ourselves. It makes total sense, Yasha. Thank you.
Can I take that just one spiritual level?
Please.
Further, the ritual to Freemasonry is like the body to your spirit. In other words, I, Yasha, am not my body. Now, I say this, you already know, and I can mention it here. I'm suffering from Parkinson's, and I was diagnosed about 4 years ago. The way I decided to tackle that is by saying that I, Yasha, am not my body. My body has got Parkinson's. I am okay. So I'm now going to take care of my body because I have to live in it as long as I'm in this world. And I will behave towards my body very nicely and considerately. But I'm not going to let my body take control of my life. I'm going to continue to do the things I want to do, to talk to you with as energetically as long as, even though my body tries to drag me down, I will fight it. So I've got this dual relationship. And maybe to some extent you can compare that fact that you've got a body as opposed to a spiritual status, you can compare it also in Freemasonry. That Freemasonry as a concept is not the ritual. The ritual is only the body which Freemasonry carries itself in.
I love the analogy. It's brilliant. Thank you, Yasha. During your journey, I saw, your online video about the Royal Arch and the way that you explain. You obviously are passionate about history, and that was one of the drivers that you mentioned earlier about, entering into Freemasonry. And writing books probably comes very natural at a certain point with the passion of having, the time to go through details that brought us to where we are today. How did you come to write books and articles? And, you have published a Royal Arch book that I mentioned in the article later on. What did it bring you there, and how did that type of work, because writing a book is not an easy task, help you to appreciate even further the knowledge of Freemasonry that you had?
Well, that last comment you just made, how did it make me appreciate Freemasonry, is really the key to it. I started writing for 2 reasons, basically. One was because it was my own notes that I was making as to what I was learning about Freemasonry. It wasn't necessarily for publication purposes. It was like keeping a diary. But keeping a diary which suddenly began to fascinate me because of what I was experiencing. But the second thing is what I already mentioned, the fact that all my life had been a collector. I used to collect coins and I used to collect this and that, and I went on to paper money, and I collected playing cards, and I collected books, and also everything all my life from the age of, as far as I can remember, back to the age of 8 in Israel. When I first went to Israel, I was a collector. Suddenly I came into this wonderful world of Freemasonry, where collecting fitted in absolutely perfect. That is the niche I was talking about. Here I came into an institution that was in its current format as a modern Freemasonry, 300 years old. So there was plenty of antiquities you can collect and think about. Beautiful history, which covered the world and Freemasonry itself with legends and stories and factual events and continuity. And a range of collectibles that covered every single collectible you can think of. Whether you're talking about Masonic furniture or whether you're talking about a Masonic matchbox. Doesn't matter what you collect, you can find it in Freemasonry as a subject of Masonic items, Masonic stamps, Masonic coins, Masonic paper money, Masonic books. So to me, it was like diving into a swimming pool of exactly what I wanted. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
And the first thing I did is I started collecting Masonic tokens because I was into coins anyway. And I found some Masonic tokens. I was very lucky because in my lodge, where I was initiated faith and friendship, I had a very good friend in the secretary who encouraged me a great deal. And he allowed me to give my first lecture about Masonic coins into the lodge, to the members of the lodge. So that I could share with them what I was finding so curious. But what is ironic is that my enthusiasm about Freemasonry paid off very nicely in a strange way. Although I didn't have to go to all the meetings, because when I was an entered apprentice Freemason, I couldn't attend second degree or third degree meetings. But I still used to go to the lodge for the opening, and then they used to kick me out.
Yeah.
So at those meetings when I was out, I met the Tyler, and the Tyler was a member of the Quattro Coronati Lodge. And I had as interesting meetings with the Tyler outside the lodge as they were having inside. Because it was just this history. And of course, as soon as I was able to, I joined the Quattro Coronati Lodge. I joined it as a member like you are now. And I attended and so on. And I was invited to join. And the rest is history.
Brilliant. Yasha, author, writer, but you also read books. Which is the author that inspire you, that influence your way of writing, the way of bringing forward your message? Is there one?
There are several people who influenced me a great deal, I must say, but I can, as I said already once now, I've got to the age where I'm looking back now, so it's easier to analyze to some extent what influences me. When you are there, when you are under the influence itself, you cannot always recognize what is influencing you. But when you look back, you can be more judgmental about it. I think there are two aspects. One is unquestionably John Hamill. John Hamill, with whom I became friendly while he was still a librarian of the Grand Lodge of England. He's recently retired almost completely now. But he was always very, very clear. He was, in everything that he explained. I really appreciated his clarity that took into account the listener and the audience he was addressing, whether it's a reader of his books or in his lectures. And to me, that made a big difference. He also had the habit of not usually using notes. He didn't use notes.
Oh.
And I did exactly the same. I've never used notes in all my lectures, in all my talks. I made the point of learning it first and then just delivering it as free. John told me one time, he said, the great advantage of that is that it doesn't matter if you forget something because nobody knows you have forgotten it. So don't stop and say, oh, I should have told you, I should have said, So he was a very strong influence in the way I lectured and I started writing books. In the latter part of my Freemasonry, in the last 3 or 4 years, I found a spiritual side that I've been neglecting all my life, all my Masonic life. Because I had been going into Freemasonry in a very dogmatic, historical manner, about collecting, about history, and so on and so forth, I really had left the spiritual side behind. And it took me some time to be influenced by the spiritual aspect. So more recently, I'm talking about the last five years of my Freemasonry. That is totally 8 years, because I've been inactive in the last 2 years. The one person who really had the strongest influence on me was Michael Bagent. Now, he's quite a well-known author of several books that are... Quattro Coronati is not very happy with Michael Bagent because he had a lot of interesting spiritual theories. And Quattro Coronati says no philosophy, you go straight down to factual, evidenced texts, you know. But Michael and I traveled throughout England writing a series. He was the editor of the Masonic Square.
Yeah.
Which later became the official publication of the Grand Lodge of England. And we started doing a series of articles of the provincial museums throughout England and Scotland and Wales. And we used to travel together and spend time together. And when we went to Jersey, in the Channel Islands, we spent the night, we stayed overnight there, and we had the late evening together. And something sort of hit me of understanding. You know how sometimes something clicks?
Yeah.
And this happened with him, and I suddenly realized that there is an aspect of Freemasonry that was missing in my activities, and I was already very involved in three jurisdictions, as I mentioned. He also told me at that meeting that he had been diagnosed with cancer of the liver.
Ooh.
And that, in fact, he wasn't going to recover, and he was on his way to New Zealand. I was the first person he mentioned this to. We were together, and he said he was going to tell his family in New Zealand, and please not to mention it to anyone else. But he said it with a spirit that was absolutely sincere and honest, which I could really identify with. And I said, aren't you worried? Aren't you? He said, there's nothing to worry about. He said, all is that happening is that I'm going back to where I came from. And I feel content enough to look forward to it, in fact. I'm not very happy about the pain I might suffer towards the end. But so far as dying goes, it's just the completion of what must happen anyway. We start dying, and this was his comment, we start dying from the day of our birth, he said. I think that is the beginning of my spiritual journey, which I'm going to carry on now, not only till the end of my life, but into my next life, because I've become a Buddhist in the meantime.
Ah. Is it the reason why you start looking at your body and your soul
Yes.
as a companionship rather than just be one?
Yeah, absolutely. All my spiritual side now is Buddhist. I go to a Buddhist temple, obviously now only by Zoom, but quite regularly, twice a week and so on. So, and Buddhism is a wonderful, it's not a religion, it's a mode of teaching, because there is no God and there is no dogma.
In Buddhism, you search for the light. You're aiming at reaching enlightenment. That's what Siddhartha actually had in his own journey up to the point that he became Buddha under the tree.
Absolutely.
In the Masonic journey, we don't look for enlightenment as enlightenment in itself, but the perfection of the stone, the ashlar, that we start from a rough form, and we are taught to actually, work on it and smooth the angles. And so, is there a parallel sorry, this question is not written. I'm just reacting to what you just said.
That's okay.
But is there a parallel in between the Masonic search of perfecting ourselves as individuals and the enlightenment path that Siddhartha began, and then until when he became Buddha.
Except for the fact that in Buddhism there is an afterlife, which we don't necessarily practice in Freemasonry.
True.
There is a Freemasonry's philosophy, it's the actual esoteric philosophy, is the same as the Buddhism. To perfect ourselves in enlightenment. I mean, all we want to do is to become better and to do good to others. So both are identical. The advantage that Buddhism gives you, if there might be such a thing as a concept of advantage in belonging to institutions, is that you have more time. Somebody said to me, when I said I've gone into Buddhism and I'm looking both at the practice, like the ritual we have got is the actual practice of the philosophy, but there is also the history of Buddhism, which you just mentioned, the Buddha and so forth. So I said, I'm looking at Buddhism the same way as I liked Freemasonry. I love the history of it and the application of its history. He said, but Yasha, at 80, you don't have that much time left to study Buddhism as you studied Freemasonry. My answer was the contrary. I've got much more time because I can continue after life.
It's a very good one, Yasha. That's a brilliant answer. I have tons of questions about this, but I will be taking too much away from the interview. So I will reserve the Buddhist part later. Like, for example, the 7 lives. And, we need 7 Masons to make a lodge perfect, and
Sure.
7 or more, etc. Let's take this for another one because I don't want to take too much of your time today. But thank you very much. I really love that you are addressing this aspect. It's very interesting, Yasha. When I look at the books that you wrote, when I try to, from outside, look into your journey as just, as a vision of whatever is publicly visible of your life, the work that you did with the Royal Arch is fascinating. I mean, I've been recently reading this summer a book about the schism between the ancient and the moderns, and a lot it was already reflected in your lecture that is online, and again, all the brethren will receive the link. But the other side of your publication is actually not about, nitty-gritty historical events. Is almost more about the camaraderie aspect of Freemasonry. Is that explicit? Is that you saying ritual is the tool, like you just mentioned earlier, but there is way more that makes us perfect than just the tools?
Yes, the answer is that, why do we become Freemasons generally? It's very few of us that become Freemasons knowing why we are actually going to become Freemasons at the end. It's much easier to look back and say, I became a Freemason because it appealed to me spiritually. I became a Freemason because of its historical content. We don't know. We join, excuse me, we join finally by force of circumstance. Somebody in our family is a Freemason, we meet somebody and so on. But what we all have in common when we join it is that we look at it as a pastime. It's a hobby. None of us join it for a profession, well, except for those who are working on Grand Lodge. I'm talking about ordinary brethren.
Yeah.
None of us join it for a specific purpose, like a job or like a wedding or like a marriage or like anything like that. All of us are there because we want to have a break from life. And there is no better way of having a break from life than in somewhere where you are having fun. And there's no better fun than when you laugh. And there's no better way of laughing than at stories. So that takes me to why I've written stories and little books that is for the pleasure and enjoyment of the brethren. Now,
let's go back 1 second to the serious aspect, the work that you did. You have been, you're a past master of the Quatuor Coronati. You're a member of other research lodges, I mean, the one from Detroit in the US. I have had the pleasure to read historical books, and I'm passionate by history as well. But is there a difference across cultures about the drive of rediscover, properly document, safely maintain our history across the world? Or are we all doing the same work and then, just building parallel histories?
The only way I can answer your question, if I understand it correctly, is almost a negative way. It seems to me that there are nations where Freemasonry has been taken advantage of in order to politicize it, or in order to use it as a persecution for the identification of certain people. So it's a question almost of balance of where Freemasonry is good and does good, as opposed to where Freemasonry is seen not to be positive, not to be good. In Mexico, if you're not a Freemason, it is more difficult for you to be a politician, to become a politician. In other words, when they give you the forms to fill in anywhere for your application to join a party, it's your name, your date of birth, the university which you belong to, the Freemasons Lodge which you belong to. If you don't fill in the Freemasons Lodge, people don't like it. There's something suspicious about you as a man.
Interesting. I didn't
Now,
know.
that's a wonderfully positive aspect of Freemasonry. And it is exactly the opposite that we had in England, of all places, where you had to put in whether you belong to the Freemasons or not, and you were discriminated against if you said yes, you are a Freemason. So we see those two balances, aspects of extremes. And of course, we want to be in the middle. As Freemasons, our hope in our institution says, look, we are here to enjoy our own fraternity, to enjoy aspects that belong to us. We're not a political party. We're not a religious party. We don't have those aspects which in life have a natural antagonism within it. In Freemasonry, there is nothing antagonistic. But unfortunately, of course, we can't always apply that in the different cultures we apply to our behavior.
Which part of history, Freemason history, marked you the most? Is there
Well, to me, sorry.
No. Is there a moment that?
Well, yes. As an English Freemason, I have chosen 1813, which is the date of the Union, as my dividing line. I am fascinated by everything before 1813. After 1813, it becomes modern history for me, modern Masonic history. Before 1813, back to about 1717 and before that, it becomes far more fascinating. And let's not forget the differentiation between stonemasons as the working lodges, as the operative stonemasons, as opposed to modern Freemasonry, the craft masons of today.
Do you see Freemasonry going somewhere next? I'm talking about the next 100 years, 200 years.
I'm not sure of the difference between the next 10 years as opposed to the next 100 years. It's easier to consider what the immediate future, the next 10, 20, 30 years. Very difficult to think what will happen in 100 years because there are so many other factors that would come into the picture, which you can't even imagine. But looking to the immediate future, I'm not very optimistic for the simple reason of the historical statistics that we look at. Everything since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War, when there was a surge up in the Freemasonry's popularity as the soldiers returned home and were looking for something, the same fraternity they had during the war as soldiers, they found in Freemasonry. That brought a sort of that almost applies to all the countries of the world, places like Australia and certainly Commonwealth countries. After that surge, there begins a decline. And that decline since 1946, 48, 50 hasn't basically stopped. It's still a decline. And the unfortunate virus we're suffering from today is, of course, adding to that as well. Unfortunately, I think some of that is permanent. Masonic temples are closing down. Freemasonry is dropping in membership. The competitive organizations that have come up that compete with Freemasonry, which gives you different options and therefore you don't join Freemasonry, have increased. The old time traditions of Freemasonry don't apply today anymore. The ones that really were very binding, that were very individualistic. So I'm not positive from the immediate future, unfortunately. I don't think there is going to be a complete, a complete sort of disintegration of the organization. But the main object of Freemasonry, the practical one, which is charity, is beginning to suffer as well. And there isn't as much funds available.
COVID-19 is not, a pandemic is not the first time that we go through. I mean, we had the Spanish flu and there were other type of sicknesses. Do you see this as an addition to what you just mentioned as one of the reasons why Freemasonry will suffer? Like the lack of camaraderie. People are not getting together. Brethren cannot get together. They cannot perform the ritual. They cannot do LOIs. They cannot have the social aspect of it. Is there also an additional element that might endanger the future of Freemasonry?
I mean, I'm a positive man in general, in spite of the recent comments I just made about Freemasonry. I'm very positive and optimistic about things. And the coronavirus, in some ways, has brought opportunities which we didn't have before. I have been attending meetings in Israel, Italy, United States of America, all of them by Zoom, which has been fantastic.
Yeah.
Not only that, but I could put on, my apron and collar. I didn't even have to put my trousers on, and I could go to the meeting.
I'm sure you're not the only one.
So there is that aspect that has been positive in the sense that we have suddenly a new windows opened, and this might indicate something for the future. We don't know. It might increase the sizes of lodges, and where every lodge we will have a screen to welcome brethren from the other parts of the world. So I think that if we can harness it correctly, there might be an advantage to what we have discovered. And of course, this can apply to many other aspects.
Yeah.
The second comment on that is that what is the genuine spirituality of a meeting, of a get-together, when we sit in temple? In spite of my intense interest on the historical and practical aspects of Freemasonry, now that I look back, I remember the very first meetings that I used to go to, the ones of the second and third degree, where I only sat in the lodge for a few moments, and then they kicked me out. I still found that the common mentality, the common state of mind of all those present, the fact that we are all there for the same reason, with the same state of mind, with this wonderful fraternal feeling of positivity and love in this lodge together at the same time. This is what brings us together. And we can do that as much in the presence of each other in a room, in a temple, and I'm applying this as much to Buddhism as I do to Freemasonry, as we can at a distance by Zoom. It doesn't matter that a brother is in New Zealand and one is in Turkey and one is in England, but we're all there together in our thinking, in our affection for each other, in our beliefs, truth, and pleasure and enjoyment. So from that point of view, Zoom again expands what is normally limited to a single room for a couple of hours, expands suddenly to an international communication, as long as we keep the spiritual element of what is in common and don't forget what we are enjoying, like meditation.
We're going to close, and like I mentioned on my document that I sent you, you were taught to be cautious. So, as an author, also you keep your cards close to your chest. But you mentioned your evolution from body to mind to spirit, and looking at what you have written, what you have studied, and in which phase you are now of your life journey. Are you working on actually writing a book about this, about your experience? Is that one of your plans?
Well, unfortunately, as I told you during our interview, I lose concentration easily. This has been very pleasurable, this exchange between us just now. I've enjoyed it, and you're very simpatico, let me say. And it's a pleasure to meet you. And they were very easygoing questions. And but I'm physically now quite tired. The adrenaline has been going, which has been very good. And unfortunately, this is one of my limitations. I'm trying to write a book at the moment, and I've got 12 books that are on sale on Amazon.
Yeah.
12. I'd like to make it 13. It's a good number.
Yeah.
The book I'm writing at the moment, if I manage, the difference basically is that the 12 books I've written so far, I've always been commissioned to write them.
Oh.
Which means that I've always had an obligation to finish the book by a certain date, and somebody was phoning me and saying, how are you doing? Have you finished it? Something. So now to write a book without that discipline of being commissioned to write it is wonderful. Because I can go where I like, there's no pressure, I can write what I like, I can deviate. Suddenly suddenly I can write a bit more about Buddhism and a little bit about Freemasonry. But the book I'm writing is entitled The Advantages of Having Parkinson's. And it's going to be a combined light-hearted and not light-hearted look into my life since I was actually
Diagnosed
with Parkinson's. Freemasonry, of course, comes into it very much as a background, as a basis on which Parkinson's sits. But I have the feeling that might be a lifetime's work.
Well,
unless somebody comes up and says, if you finish it by December, I'll publish it for you.
I will call Martin. I will ask if he is willing to sign for it. Yasha, thank you so much. Those were my questions. I really and truly enjoyed.